I stood in the opulent dressing room of a Manhattan luxury hotel, the soft glow of a crystal chandelier casting flecks of light across the pristine white wedding gown I wore. My fingers trembled as I reached for the zipper on the side, pulling it up with a slow, deliberate motion, as if I could delay the inevitable. The silk felt cold against my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth I'd felt just hours ago when I'd brewed chamomile tea for my mother in the hospital's tiny kitchenette. She'd smiled at me then, her frail hand resting on mine, her voice a whisper as she said, "You're most beautiful when you're happy, Charlotte." But I wasn't happy. Not today. Not when I was about to become the wife of James Carver, a 35-year-old billionaire I'd never met. A man my father had promised me to in a desperate bid to save our family from ruin. I'm Charlotte Bennett, 28 years old, and I've never been in love. Not because I'm old-fashioned or prudish, but because I've always put my family first. In my 28 years, I've never let a man close enough to claim my heart, or my body. The thought of giving myself to a stranger, someone who saw me as nothing, more than a transaction, made my stomach churn. I stared at my reflection in the gilded mirror, my hazel eyes brimming with a storm of emotions, anger, fear, betrayal. My chestnut hair was swept into an elegant updo, a few curls framing my face. But all I could see was a woman who'd become a pawn in a game she never wanted to play. My father, once a respected businessman in Boston's elite circles, had lost everything after a failed investment deal. The Bennett name, which had once opened doors in the highest echelons of society, now carried the weight of shame and debt. Our family's legacy, 3 generations of pride, had crumbled, and my father, the man I'd once idolized, was a shadow of himself. A week ago, he'd sat me down in our dimly lit living room, his voice trembling as he explained the deal. "James Carver will pay off our debts, Charlotte," he'd said, avoiding my gaze. "He'll make sure we don't lose the house, that your mother gets the treatment she needs. All he asks is that you marry him." I'd wanted to scream, to throw something, to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not when my mother's life depended on it. My mother didn't know about the deal. My father had kept it from her, saying it would break her heart to see her only daughter sold like a piece of property. She'd been in the hospital for months, her heart condition worsening with every passing day. The cost of her treatment was astronomical, far beyond what we could afford after the collapse of my father's company. So I'd agreed, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. I'd do anything to save my mother, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness. But as I stood here, staring at myself in this dress, the reality of what I was about to do hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't just giving up my freedom. I was giving up my dignity, my dreams, my very self. I clutched the pearl necklace my mother had given me before she'd been admitted, the one she'd worn on her own wedding day. Its cool surface pressed against my palm, grounding me as I whispered to my reflection, "I'm just a promise." The words tasted bitter on my tongue, each syllable a reminder of how I'd been reduced to a bargaining chip. I wasn't a bride walking down the aisle to a man I loved. I was a commodity, a means to an end. James Carver, the billionaire CEO of Carver Tech, was my father's savior. But to me, he was a stranger, a man whose cold reputation preceded him. I'd read about him in Forbes, seen his sharp features and icy blue eyes in glossy photographs. They called him ruthless, a man who never let emotions cloud his decisions. And now, he was coming to claim me, to make me his wife in a marriage that felt more like a merger than a union. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, but my mind drifted back to the hospital that morning. My mother's room had smelled of antiseptic and faint lavender, her favorite scent. I'd brought her a small tin of chamomile tea, the kind she loved, and brewed it in a paper cup while she watched me with tired eyes. "You don't have to do this if it's not what you want," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd forced a smile, brushing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. "It's just a wedding, Mom," I'd lied. I'll be fine. But I wasn't fine. I was drowning in a sea of resentment, guilt, and fear, and the weight of my father's promise was pulling me under. The door to the dressing room creaked open, and I turned to see my father standing there, his face etched with exhaustion. "It's time, Charlotte," he said, his voice hollow. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he'd done this to me. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when my mother's life hung in the balance. So I nodded, my throat tight, and followed him out of the room, the train of my gown trailing behind me like a ghost of the life I'd never have. As we walked toward the grand ballroom where the ceremony would take place, I felt the chandelier's light above me dim, as if it, too, knew the darkness that awaited me at the altar. The heavy wooden doors of the ancient church in central New York creaked open, revealing a sanctuary bathed in the ethereal glow of stained glass windows. Rays of crimson, sapphire, and gold spilled across the marble floor, painting the space in a mosaic of colors that felt far too beautiful for the cold reality of my situation. The air was thick with the scent of white roses and aged wood, a fragrance that should have been comforting but instead made my chest tighten. I, Charlotte Bennett, stepped forward, the train of my wedding gown trailing behind me like a shadow I couldn't escape. My father's hand rested lightly on my arm, guiding me down the aisle, but his touch felt more like a tether than a comfort. The murmurs of the crowd, strangers dressed in designer suits and glittering gowns, followed me, their whispers sharp as knives. I wasn't a bride to them. I was a spectacle, a curiosity in their glittering world of wealth and power. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, refusing to meet the gazes of the elite who'd gathered to witness this sham of a wedding. They weren't my friends or family. They were James Carver's associates, his investors, his allies in the cutthroat world of billion-dollar deals. My mother wasn't here. She couldn't be. Not with her heart condition keeping her tethered to a hospital bed. My father had insisted we keep the truth from her, claiming it would break her to know I'd been traded like a commodity to save our family. But as I walked, the weight of that secret pressed down on me, heavier than the silk of my gown. I felt like a doll on display, dressed up for a role I never wanted to play. And then I saw him. James Carver. He stood at the altar, tall and imposing, in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His presence was magnetic, undeniable, the kind of aura that commanded a room without a single word. His jaw was sharp, his dark hair swept back with precision, but it was his eyes that struck me most, ice blue and piercing, devoid of warmth. They locked onto mine as I approached, and I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from the chill of the church, but from the intensity of his gaze. He extended a hand toward me, a gesture that should have been inviting, but to me, it felt like a claim. I stopped short, my father's hand falling away as I stood just out of James's reach. My voice trembled, but I forced the words out, each one a defiance I hadn't known I possessed. "I don't want this." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a ripple of shock spreading through the pews. But James didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, a flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossing his otherwise impassive face. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice low and smooth, like velvet over steel. "Your father made a promise, and I'm here to see it through. I need a wife, Charlotte, to solidify my image for the shareholders. This isn't about love. It's about business." His words were a blade, slicing through what little hope I'd clung to. Business. That's all I was to him. A transaction. A means to an end. My father's promise had made me his, and he'd come to collect me, just as I'd feared. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The weight of the pearl necklace around my throat felt suffocating, a reminder of my mother's absence and the reason I'd agreed to this in the first place. I wanted to run, to tear off this dress and flee from the church, from James, from the suffocating expectations of a world I didn't belong to. But I couldn't. Not when my mother's life depended on the money James had promised to pay for her treatment. Not when my father's hollow eyes pleaded with me to go through with it. So I stayed, my heart pounding in my chest as the elderly priest began the ceremony, his voice a solemn drone that echoed through the cavernous space. The moment of truth came too quickly. "Charlotte Bennett," the priest said, his kind eyes meeting mine. "Do you take James Carver to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The crowd leaned forward, their whispers falling silent as they waited for my response. I could feel James's gaze on me, steady and unyielding, as if he already knew I'd bend to his will. My father's hand tightened on the back of my arm, a silent plea. But something inside me snapped, a fire I hadn't known I possessed, a refusal to let myself be reduced to nothing more than a promise. I turned to James, meeting his icy stare with a fire of my own. "I refuse," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the stillness like a gunshot. The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs, their shock palpable. But I didn't care. I pulled my arm free from my father's grip, the pearl necklace at my throat feeling lighter than it had all day. James's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "You're braver than I thought," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. And then, without another word, he took my hand, not to force me, but to lead me out of the church, away from the chaos I'd just unleashed. I tore myself away from James's grip the moment we stepped outside the church, the crisp New York air hitting my face like a slap. The stained glass glow of the sanctuary was behind me now, replaced by the harsh sunlight of reality. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild drumbeat of adrenaline and defiance, as the murmurs of the crowd faded into a distant hum. I didn't look back at James, at the man I'd just publicly rejected, nor at the sea of shocked faces I'd left in my wake. I couldn't. All I could think about was my mother, her frail smile, her whispered words that morning, the way her hand had felt so cold in mine as I'd brewed her tea. She needed me now, more than ever, and I needed her to know the truth. I climbed into my father's car, the wedding gown bunching awkwardly around me as I slammed the door shut. My father followed, his face pale, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. "Charlotte, what have you done?" he asked, his voice a broken whisper, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words were lodged in my throat, tangled with a fury I hadn't known I was capable of. Instead, I stared out the window, watching the city blur past as we drove toward the hospital. The pearl necklace at my throat felt heavier than ever, a reminder of my mother's absence at the ceremony, and the reason I'd been standing at that altar in the first place. When we arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, I didn't wait for my father. I pushed open the car door and hurried inside, the hem of my gown trailing across the linoleum floor as I made my way to my mother's room. The hospital was a maze of sterile white walls and the faint smell of antiseptic, but I knew the path to her room by heart. When I stepped inside, the dim light from a bedside lamp cast a soft glow over her fragile form. My mother lay propped up on pillows, her gray hair fanned out against the stark white linens, her eyes half closed. But they opened when she heard me, and a faint smile curved her lips. "Charlotte," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You look beautiful." I sank into the chair beside her bed, my hands reaching for hers, the warmth of her skin a stark contrast to the cold dread in my chest. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking as I clutched her hand. "I didn't go through with it. I couldn't." Her smile faltered, confusion clouding her tired eyes. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. The words poured out of me like a flood, raw and unfiltered. I told her about my father's deal with James Carver, about how he'd promised me to a billionaire to save our family from ruin, to pay for her treatment. I told her how I'd stood at the altar, how I'd felt like nothing more than a promise, a transaction, and how I'd refused to say, "I do." My mother's eyes filled with tears, her hand tightening around mine as she listened. "He didn't tell me," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sorrow. "Your father, he didn't tell me, but I knew he was desperate. I knew he'd do anything to keep me alive." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, the weight of her understanding mingling with my own pain. I'd always known my father, loved my mother more than anything, but to hear her say it, to know she'd suspected something like this, made the betrayal cut even deeper. "I'm so sorry, Charlotte," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never wanted this. For you." I wiped her tears away with the edge of my sleeve, the white silk of my gown now stained with mascara and regret. "It's not your fault, Mom," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But I need to know why. I need to hear it from him." I kissed her forehead, promising to return soon, and left the room, my resolve hardening with every step. When I got back to the car, my father was waiting, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. I didn't speak as we drove home, the silence between us heavy with unspoken questions. At home, I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the worn wooden table where my mother and I used to bake Christmas cookies every year. The memory of her laughter, the smell of cinnamon and sugar, felt like a lifetime ago as I faced him now. "Why, Dad?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Why did you do this to me?" He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Because I couldn't lose her, Charlotte," he said, his voice raw. "James promised to pay off our debts, to cover your mother's surgery. I had no other choice. I couldn't let her die." His confession shattered something inside me. I understood his desperation, his love for my mother, but it didn't erase the pain of being sold like a piece of property. I sank into a chair across from him, my wedding gown pooling around me like a fallen dream. "You should have told me the truth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You should have let me decide." He nodded, tears streaming down, his face. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort him. Not yet. My heart was a battlefield, torn between love for my family and the betrayal that had brought me to this moment. I'd refused James, but the cost of that refusal was a rift I wasn't sure I could ever mend. The days following my refusal at the altar blurred into a haze of sleepless nights and whispered conversations. I, Charlotte Bennett, had become the talk of New York's elite, my name splashed across tabloids and gossip columns with headlines that stung like nettles. "Runaway bride, James Carver humiliated at the altar," and "Bennett family betrays billionaire savior." Each article was a dagger, twisting deeper into the fragile remnants of my family's dignity. The world didn't see me as a woman who'd stood up for herself. They saw me as a scandal, a reckless girl who'd spat in the face of a man who'd offered to save us. The Bennett name, already tarnished by my father's financial ruin, was now synonymous with betrayal in the eyes of the upper echelons of society. I tried to shield my mother from the fallout, but the whispers of the hospital staff and the pitying glances from visitors made it impossible. Even in her weakened state, she sensed the storm I'd unleashed. "They're saying awful things about us, aren't they?" she asked one morning, her voice barely audible over the beeping of her heart monitor. I forced a smile, adjusting the blanket over her frail frame. "It's just noise, Mom," I lied, brushing a strand of gray hair from her forehead. "It'll pass." But it didn't pass. If anything, the scrutiny grew worse. My father started, receiving threatening calls from creditors, their voices cold and menacing as they demanded payment now that James's promised funds were off the table. The weight of it all pressed down on me, a suffocating reminder of the cost of my defiance. I sought refuge in the one place I thought I could escape the prying eyes of the city, a small tucked-away cafe in Brooklyn, far from the glittering towers of Manhattan. The air inside was warm, scented with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee beans. I sat in a corner booth, my hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, the same kind I'd made for my mother in the hospital. The steam rose in lazy curls, and for a moment, I let myself pretend I was just another woman enjoying a quiet morning. But the illusion shattered when the bell above the door jingled, and James Carver walked in. He spotted me immediately, his tall frame cutting through the cozy space with an authority that made the other patrons glance up from their newspapers. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his dark hair swept back, his ice blue eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I straightened in my seat, my grip tightening on the mug as he approached and slid into the booth across from me without asking. "You've made quite a mess, Charlotte," he said, his voice low and controlled. But there was an edge to it, a sharpness that cut through the warmth of the cafe. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my reputation?" I met his gaze, my own anger flaring to match his. "I don't care about your reputation, James," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I care about my family. I care about my mother, who's lying in a hospital bed, while the world tears us apart for something I had no say in." My words hung between us, heavy and raw, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or understanding. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold, calculating mask I'd come to associate with him. "You think you're the only one with something to lose?" he asked, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I have a family too, Charlotte. Or at least, I did. I walked away from them to build this empire, to become the man I am today. I sacrificed everything, my mother, my sister, my chance at a real life, to get here. So don't sit there and tell me you're the only one who's lost something." His words hit me like a tidal wave, cracking the image I'd built of him as a heartless billionaire. For the first time, I saw a man who'd been shaped by his own choices, a man who carried scars I hadn't imagined. But I couldn't let myself soften, not now. "I didn't ask for your help," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and exhaustion. "I didn't ask to be your wife, your pawn, your solution to a shareholder problem. You and my father made that choice for me. And I refused, because I won't let anyone, not you, not him, take away my right to decide my own life." I stood, my hands shaking as I grabbed my purse, the chamomile tea forgotten on the table. But before I could walk away, James's hand shot out, catching my wrist with a gentleness that surprised me. "I'm not your enemy, Charlotte," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I thought I was doing the right thing, for you, for your family, for me. But maybe I was wrong." He let go of my wrist, his hand falling to the table as he looked up at me, his icy facade cracking just enough for me to see the man beneath. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the vulnerability in his words. So I turned and walked out of the cafe, the bell jingling behind me as I stepped into the gray Brooklyn morning, my heart a tangled mess of anger, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. The days after my confrontation with James in the Brooklyn cafe stretched into a tense, uneasy rhythm. I, Charlotte Bennett, tried to focus on my mother's recovery, spending hours by her hospital bed, reading her favorite novels aloud or simply holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep. But the weight of the scandal I'd caused clung to me like a shadow, darkening every moment. The tabloids hadn't let up, their headlines growing more vicious with each passing day. Carver's rejection, a tale of greed and betrayal. I stopped reading them, but I couldn't escape the whispers. At the hospital, at the grocery store, even in the quiet sanctuary of our old family home in the suburbs. The world saw me as a villain, a spoiled girl who'd thrown away her family's salvation for pride. They didn't know the truth, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to tell it. I was in the kitchen one evening, stirring a pot of chicken noodle soup for my father, when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me, the ladle slipping from my hand and clattering against the counter. My father, who'd been sitting at the table with a glass of whiskey, looked up with a frown. "Who could that be at this hour?" he muttered, but I waved him off, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I made my way to the door. When I opened it, a woman stood there, her dark hair streaked with gray, her face etched with exhaustion. She looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place her, until she spoke. "Charlotte," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm Laura, James's sister." My breath caught in my throat. I'd never met Laura, hadn't even known James had a sister until his cryptic admission in the cafe about the family he'd left behind. She stepped inside before I could invite her, her eyes scanning the modest living room with a mix of curiosity and sadness. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," she said, clutching a worn leather purse to her chest. "But I needed to talk. To you. About James. About why he agreed to your father's deal." My father appeared in the doorway behind me, his expression wary, but I gestured for him to stay back. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why? Are you here?" Laura sat on the edge of our faded couch, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "James isn't the man you think he is," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "He's not just a cold billionaire who wanted a trophy wife. He agreed to marry you because he thought it would make up for what he did to us. To me, to our mother." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Years ago, when James was starting Carver Tech, he walked away from us. He was obsessed with success, with proving himself to the world. He left me to care for our mother alone, and she died, Charlotte. She died in a hospice bed, alone, while James was off building his empire. I begged him to come back to say goodbye, but he didn't. He couldn't face her." Her words hit me like a freight train, each one shattering the image I'd built, of James as a heartless tycoon. I'd thought his decision to marry me was purely pragmatic, a business move to appease his shareholders. But Laura's revelation painted a different picture. A man haunted by guilt, desperate to atone for a past he couldn't change. "When your father came to him, begging for help," Laura continued, "James saw a chance to do something good, to save a family the way he couldn't save ours. He thought marrying you, helping your mother, would somehow balance the scales. But he didn't tell me. He didn't tell anyone. I only found out through the news, through the headlines about your refusal. I came because I need him, Charlotte. I need my brother back." I sank into the armchair across from her, my mind reeling. Laura wasn't just here to explain James's motives. She was here because she was hurting, because she'd been carrying the weight of their broken family for years. I thought of my own family, my mother's frail hand in mine, my father's tear-streaked face as he'd confessed his desperation. We were all broken, in our own way, bound by the choices we'd made for the ones we loved. "I didn't know," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I thought he was just using me." Laura nodded, her expression softening. "He's not a monster, Charlotte. He's a man who's lost his way. But he needs to face what he's done. Not just to me, but to you." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with truth, and I knew I couldn't ignore them. I needed to see James, to confront him with this new understanding, to see the man behind the mask he wore so well. That night, I drove to his office in Manhattan, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold against the dark sky. The Carver Tech building was a towering monolith of glass and steel, its top floors glowing like a beacon. I found James in his corner office, standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of scotch in his hand. The city sprawled beneath him, a kingdom he'd built at a cost I was only beginning to understand. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. He turned, his ice blue eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, I saw something raw in them, vulnerability. "Tell you what?" he asked, but I could hear the defensiveness in his tone. "About your mother," I said, stepping closer. "About Laura. About why you really agreed to marry me." His expression faltered, the glass in his hand trembling slightly. "Because I didn't want your pity," he said, his voice low and rough. "I wanted you to see me as a man, not a failure." In that moment, I saw him. Not the billionaire, not the cold CEO, but a man who'd lost everything that mattered in his pursuit of power. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Compassion. The revelation about James's past lingered in my mind like a storm cloud, heavy and unyielding, as I, Charlotte Bennett, tried to piece together the fractured image I'd had of him. I'd seen a glimpse of the man beneath the billionaire's mask, a man haunted by guilt, driven by a need to atone for the family he'd abandoned. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. My mother's condition took a sudden turn for the worse, shattering the fragile calm I'd been clinging to. I'd been sitting by her bedside at St. Mary's Hospital, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest when the doctor pulled me aside. "Her heart is failing faster than we expected," he said, his voice grave. "She needs emergency surgery. Tonight. But the cost, it's beyond what your insurance covers." His words felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I stumbled back to my mother's room, my hands trembling as I gripped the doorframe. She looked so small in that hospital bed, her gray hair fanned out against the pillow, her eyes closed in fitful sleep. I couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after everything we'd been through. But my father's confession echoed in my mind. James had withdrawn his financial support after I'd refused him at the altar. The money we needed for my mother's surgery, the money that had been part of my father's desperate deal, was gone. There was only one person I could turn to. One person who could help, and I hated that it had to be him. I drove through the pouring rain to James's mansion on the outskirts of Manhattan, the windshield wipers struggling against the deluge. My thin coat was soaked through by the time I reached his front door, the white silk of my scarf clinging to my neck like a second skin. I pounded on the door, my fists shaking with a mix of desperation and fury, until it finally swung open. James stood there, still in his suit from the day, his ice-blue eyes widening slightly as he took in my drenched appearance. "Charlotte," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and concern. "What are you doing here?" "I don't need you," I said, my voice steady despite the rain dripping from my hair, the cold seeping into my bones. "But I need you to help. My mother. She's dying, James. She needs surgery, tonight, and we can't afford it without you." I hated how my voice broke on the last word. Hated that I was here, begging the man who'd once tried to claim me as part of a deal. But I'd do anything for my mother, even if it meant swallowing my pride. James's expression softened, a flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossing his face. "I'll help," he said, his voice low and firm. "But not because of the deal. Because of you." We drove to the hospital in his sleek black car, the rain hammering against the windows as we sped through the night. James didn't speak, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a quiet intensity. but I could feel his presence beside me, steady and unshakable. When we arrived, he spoke to the hospital administrator in hushed tones, arranging for the surgery to be covered without a moment's hesitation. I stood by my mother's bedside as the nurses prepared her, my hand wrapped around hers, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "You're going to be okay, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm here." Hours later, after the surgery was successful and my mother was stable, I found James in the hospital waiting room, his suit jacket draped over a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Rainwater still glistened in his dark hair, and for the first time, he looked almost human, exhausted, vulnerable, real. "Thank you," I said, my voice raw with gratitude as I sat beside him. "I don't know what I would have done without you." He turned to me, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen them, and for a moment, I felt a connection I hadn't expected, a shared understanding born of the night's chaos. But that fragile moment shattered when Laura appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes blazing with anger. "Charlotte," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "There's something you need to know, something James doesn't even know." I froze, my heart sinking as she continued. "Your father, he wasn't just a victim of bad investments. He worked with James's biggest rival, a man named Victor Grayson, to undermine Carver Tech years ago. It was a deal gone wrong, a betrayal that led to your family's bankruptcy. Your father's choices brought you to this point, not just James's." Her words hit me like a thunderclap, the room spinning as I processed the betrayal. My father, the man I'd forgiven just days ago, had been the architect of our ruin. Not a victim of circumstance, but a willing participant in a scheme that had destroyed us. I turned to James, expecting rage, but his face was unreadable, his jaw tight. "Is this true?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, but Laura did. "It's true," she said. "I found the documents in Victor's files. Victor told me himself. He wanted me to use it against James, but I couldn't. Not until now." The rain outside roared louder, a fitting echo of the storm now raging inside me, as I realized the full extent of the secrets that had bound us all together. The hospital waiting room was eerily silent after Laura's bombshell, the only sound the distant hum of the air conditioning and the faint patter of rain against the windows. I, Charlotte Bennett, sat frozen, my mind reeling from the revelation that my father had been complicit in our family's downfall. He hadn't just been a victim of circumstance. He'd worked with Victor Grayson, James's rival, in a failed scheme that had led to our bankruptcy. The man I'd forgiven just days ago, the man I'd believed had acted out of love for my mother, had betrayed us all in a way I couldn't fathom. I turned to James, expecting to see fury in his ice-blue eyes. But his face was a mask of restraint, his jaw clenched tight. "Is this true?" I asked again, my voice a trembling whisper. But he didn't answer. He didn't need to. Laura's words were enough. I left James in the waiting room and drove home through the fading storm, the rain now a gentle drizzle that mirrored the quiet turmoil inside me. When I stepped into our old house, the familiar creak of the floorboards felt like a betrayal of its own. My father was in the living room, sitting by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows across his haggard face. He looked up as I entered, his eyes red-rimmed, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table, beside him. "Charlotte," he said, his voice hoarse, but I cut him off before he could say more. "Tell me the truth, Dad," I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "Did you work with Victor Grayson? Did you cause our bankruptcy?" The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the fire. My father's shoulders slumped, his hands trembling as he buried his face in them. "Yes," he whispered finally, his voice breaking. "I did. I thought I could save the company, save us, by working with Victor. He promised me a deal that would keep us afloat. But it backfired. He used me, Charlotte, and when it all fell apart, I lost everything. Our savings, our reputation, our future. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. I didn't want you to see me as a failure. His confession was a knife to my heart, reopening the wound of betrayal I'd thought I'd begun to heal. I sank onto the couch across from him, the white scarf I'd worn to James's house still damp against my neck. You let me believe it. Was just bad luck, I said, my voice raw with pain. You let me think you were protecting Mom, protecting us, when you were the one who put us in this position. You sold me to James to fix your mistake. My father's tears fell freely now, his sobs echoing in the quiet room. I know, he said, his voice choked with regret. I know I failed you, Charlotte. But I couldn't lose your mother. I couldn't let her die because of my mistakes. I thought giving you to James would make things right. The room seemed to close in around me, the weight of his words pressing down like a physical force. I wanted to hate him, to scream at him for what he'd done, but all I could feel was a deep, aching sorrow. I thought of my mother in the hospital, her life hanging by a thread, and I realized that love, however flawed, however misguided, had driven him to this. I stood and crossed the room, kneeling beside him, my hands resting on his trembling shoulders. I forgive you, Dad, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. But you have to make this right, not just for me, but for all of us. He nodded, pulling me into a hug, and for the first time in years, I felt the broken pieces of our family start to mend. I knew I had to see James, to tell him the truth, and face whatever consequences came next. I found him later that day, driving through the city in his sleek black car, the rain now a faint memory as the sun broke through the clouds. We were on our way to the hospital to check on my mother, the silence between us heavy with unspoken questions. I talked to my father, I said finally, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. He admitted everything. Working with Victor, causing the bankruptcy. I didn't want you to think my family betrayed you, not after everything you've done for us. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his expression remained calm, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I don't care about the past, Charlotte, he said, his voice low and resolute. I care about the future, our future. I've spent too long running from my own mistakes, trying to fix them with money and power. But seeing how you fight for your family, it made me realize I need to do better. I'm setting up a foundation, Charlotte, a fund to help families like yours, so no one else has to make the kind of choice you did. His words caught me off guard, a spark of hope igniting in my chest. For the first time, I saw a man who wasn't just trying to atone for his past, but to build a better future, a man I could imagine standing beside. As we pulled into the hospital parking lot, James reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. We're not so different, you and I, he said, his voice soft. We've both been shaped by the promises we couldn't keep. But maybe we can make new ones, together. I looked into his eyes, no longer icy but warm with a sincerity I hadn't seen before, and I felt a shift inside me. The man I'd once refused at the altar was no longer a stranger. He was someone I could understand, someone I could trust, someone I might even come to love. A month had passed since that stormy night in the hospital, and the air felt lighter now, as if the world had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. I, Charlotte Bennett, stood on the balcony of James Carver's sprawling mansion just outside Manhattan, the evening breeze rustling the hem of my emerald green silk dress. The gown was a far cry from the white wedding dress I'd worn in that cold church, its soft fabric hugging my curves in a way that made me feel not like a pawn, but a woman, confident, whole, and finally free. Below me, the garden was alive with the glow of fairy lights, their golden hues weaving through the roses and ivy, creating a scene that felt like a dream. My mother was there, sitting in a cushioned chair with a blanket draped over her lap, her smile radiant as she chatted with my father. She'd recovered from her surgery, her laughter a melody I'd feared I'd never hear again. James had invited us here for a small gathering, a celebration of my mother's recovery and a chance for our families to come together. It wasn't the ostentatious affair of our failed wedding, with its crowd of strangers and suffocating expectations. This was intimate, real. My parents, Laura, and a few close friends who'd stood by us through the storm. I watched as Laura, James's sister, knelt beside my mother, her face soft with a warmth I hadn't seen when we'd first met. She'd told me later that she'd wanted James to face his past, to rebuild the family he'd lost. And seeing them, together now, James laughing with her, his arm around her shoulders, made my heart swell. He'd kept his promise, not just to me, but to her, establishing a foundation in their mother's name to help families like mine, ensuring no one else would have to make the sacrifices we had. I felt James's presence before I saw him, the air shifting as he stepped onto the balcony behind me. He was dressed in a simple white shirt and dark trousers, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a far cry from the imposing billionaire I'd first met. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low and warm, and I turned to face him, a smile tugging at my lips. "Thank you," I said, my fingers brushing the pearl necklace at my throat. The same one I'd worn on that fateful day in the church, now a symbol not of sacrifice, but of survival. His ice-blue eyes, once so cold, now held a depth I'd come to cherish, a reflection of the man he'd become through our shared journey. "Charlotte," he said, stepping closer, his hand reaching for mine. "I've been thinking about this moment for a long time." My breath caught as he dropped to one knee, a small velvet box appearing in his hand. The garden below fell silent, our families turning to watch as the fairy lights cast a soft glow over us. "I don't want you to be a promise someone else made," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I don't want you to be mine because of a deal, or a debt, or a mistake. I want you to be mine because you choose to be, because we choose each other. Charlotte Bennett, will you marry me, not because of your father, not because of a promise, but because of us?" Tears welled in my eyes, but they were tears of joy, a release of all the pain and fear I'd carried for so long. I thought of the church, of the moment I'd refused him, of the journey we'd taken since then, the revelations, the forgiveness, the nights we'd spent talking about our fears and dreams. I thought of my mother, alive and smiling below us, and my father, who'd begun to rebuild his life with a newfound honesty. I thought of Laura, who'd found her brother again, and of James, who'd found a way to heal the wounds of his past. And I thought of myself, not the girl who'd been a promise, but the woman I'd become, strong enough to choose her own path. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, a smile breaking through my tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." James slipped the ring onto my finger. A simple band with a single diamond, elegant and unpretentious, just like the love we'd built. He stood, pulling me into his arms, and we kissed beneath the moonlight, the stars above us bearing witness to a vow that was ours alone. It wasn't a promise made by someone else, but a promise we'd made to each other, forged in the crucible of our shared struggles. As our families applauded below, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. James had made amends with Laura, their bond stronger than ever. And I'd found a way to forgive my father, to rebuild the family I'd thought we'd lost. Under the broken chandeliers of our past, we'd found a new light, a light that shone not from wealth or power, but from love, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. I was no longer just a promise. I was Charlotte Bennett, A woman who'd found happiness, not through obligation, but through the beauty of a second chance. If you've been touched by this journey of love, redemption, and second chances, I'd love to hear from you. Please give this story a like if it resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt tales that explore the depths of family, forgiveness, and the courage to start anew. Your support means the world to me, and I can't wait to share more stories that inspire and uplift. See you in the next one.